In 1965, Singapore was a tiny island most experts thought would collapse. It had no oil, no gold, no farmland, and barely any drinking water of its own. Even its separation from Malaysia was sudden, thrown out, unwanted, and alone. At that time, Singapore had a population of just 2 million, living in crowded slums, facing high unemployment, and surrounded by powerful neighbors who weren't sure this little island should even exist. Foreign diplomats quietly wrote it off. Journalists called it a doomed city-state. Some compared it to a boat without an anchor, certain it would sink. But here's the twist. Instead of collapsing, Singapore rose. Today, it's one of the richest, safest, and most admired countries on Earth. Its GDP per capita rivals that of the United States. Its port is among the busiest in the world, and its airport repeatedly ranked the best anywhere. So how did this tiny nation, born in crisis, weak and resource poor, defy the odds? Let's step into the story of why Singapore should have failed in 1965 and why it didn't. Chapter 1. Thrown out, not freed. Independence in Singapore was not the triumphant march of flags and fireworks. It was the sting of rejection. On 9 August 1965, Malaysia's parliament voted to expel Singapore after only 2 years of merger. For Malaysia's leaders, Singapore was a troublesome partner, too outspoken, too different, and too Chinese in its demographics. For Singaporeans, it was a sudden divorce they never asked for. That morning, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew addressed the nation on television. His usually steady voice cracked, his eyes welled with tears. He confessed, "For me, it is a moment of anguish. All my life, I believed in merger and unity of the two territories." It was a rare glimpse of vulnerability from a man who would later become known for his iron will. The challenges were overwhelming. Singapore had no oil like Brunei, no rubber or tin like Malaysia. Even its water came from Johor, leaving the new nation painfully dependent on its former partner. Worse still, society was fractured. The island was home to Chinese, Malays, Indians, and others, but harmony was fragile. Just months earlier, racial riots had set the streets ablaze. Many feared independence would unleash more bloodshed. Adding to the despair, the British, long the island's economic anchor, were preparing to pull out their troops, taking tens of thousands of jobs with them. Investors fled, newspapers predicted collapse, and Singapore seemed destined to sink back into obscurity. On paper, the island looked doomed, a tiny dot with no resources, no allies, and no army. Yet in that darkest hour, Lee and his team made a choice. If survival meant rewriting history, then Singapore would not be a victim of rejection. It would become the proof that rejection could be the spark of reinvention. Chapter 2. Building an Army. Overnight, when Singapore became independent in 1965, its defense forces were almost non-existent. The entire nation could count only on 2 small infantry battalions and a lightly armed police force. No air force, no navy, and no heavy artillery. For a vulnerable island surrounded by much larger neighbors, this was a terrifying reality. But independence changed everything. The young nation understood one brutal truth: survival without defense was impossible. Relying on Malaysia or Britain for protection was no longer an option. If Singapore was to live, it had to stand on its own feet. Within months, the government made a bold and controversial move. National service. Every young man would serve in the armed forces. Some families resisted, worried about safety and disruption, but most realized there was no alternative. To survive, everyone had to contribute. Singapore needed not just manpower, but also knowledge. Help came quietly from an unlikely ally: Israel. A fellow small nation surrounded by larger hostile neighbors, Israel understood the urgency. Israeli advisors were flown in discreetly, disguised as Mexican businessmen to avoid offending countries in the region. They trained Singaporean officers in strategy, discipline, and modern defense techniques. This was about more than rifles and drills. It was about building confidence. Soldiers learned to march with precision. Tanks began to roll through training grounds. A fledgling air force took to the skies. For the first time, Singaporeans could look at their armed forces and believe their country could be defended. The impact went beyond security. A credible army reassured investors and foreign partners that Singapore was not a fragile experiment waiting to collapse. It sent a clear message to neighbors. This little red dot would not be bullied. From near defenselessness, Singapore had taken its first impossible step, transforming from a weak city into a nation determined to defend itself at any cost. Chapter 3: From Muddy Slums to Modern Homes. When Singapore was forced into independence in 1965, its people faced a daily reality of poverty that few outsiders could imagine. The island was dotted with overcrowded kampongs, wooden huts perched on muddy ground, with leaking roofs, shared latrines, and open drains running with waste. Families of 6, 7, or more squeezed into a single room. Fires could wipe out entire neighborhoods in hours, and outbreaks of disease were frequent. For Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his team, the message was clear. No nation could survive if its people lived like this. Housing wasn't just about shelter, it was about dignity, stability, and survival. The solution was the Housing and Development Board, HDB, which launched a housing program so ambitious that many foreign observers thought it impossible. Instead of patching up slums, Singapore would wipe them out and rebuild from the ground up. Towering high-rise blocks began to rise, replacing wooden shacks with apartments equipped with electricity, sanitation, and running water. But Lee's government went further. Unlike most countries, where public housing was temporary and stigmatized, Singapore gave its citizens something more powerful: ownership. Through the Central Provident Fund, CPF, working Singaporeans could use part of their wages to buy their flats. Owning a home gave families not only security, but also pride. If you owned your flat, you took care of it, and by extension, your neighborhood. By the 1980s, slums had virtually disappeared. Today, over 80% of Singaporeans live in HDB flats, yet these neighborhoods are not symbols of poverty. They are safe, clean, and respected. Housing also helped unite a divided society. The government carefully designed estates to ensure racial mixing, preventing ghettos and reducing ethnic tensions. Chinese, Malays, and Indians lived side by side, sharing playgrounds, markets, and schools. From muddy, dangerous slums rose a modern society where people shared not just walls, but a common destiny. Housing had done more than put roofs over heads. It had built the foundation of a nation. Chapter 4: No Resources. Then use your brain. When Singapore was expelled from Malaysia, one fact was painfully clear. The island had nothing the world wanted to buy. No oil wells like in the Middle East. No rubber plantations or tin mines like Malaysia. Not even enough land to grow food for its own people. Survival through natural wealth was impossible. So Singapore made a bold decision. If it could not dig riches from the ground, it would create them in the minds of its people. Education became the cornerstone of nation building. English was chosen as the working language, not to erase identity, but to unite Chinese, Malays, Indians, and Eurasians under one tongue, while linking the island directly to the global economy. Schools drilled discipline, science, mathematics, and practical skills. Technical institutes prepared young workers for factories, while universities expanded to train engineers, scientists, and business leaders. Every child was seen not just as a student, but as the future engine of the nation. At the same time, Singapore threw its doors open to the world. Foreign companies were invited with promises few others could match. A corruption-free environment, a skilled and disciplined workforce, and a government that got things done quickly. The result? American electronics firms, Japanese shipbuilders, and European manufacturers set up factories and offices. Jobs were created, skills were transferred, and technology flowed in. Instead of competing with neighbors in agriculture or mining, Singapore became the beating heart of trade, finance, and technology. The port of Singapore was modernized into one of the busiest in the world, a vital link between East and West. Changi Airport soon rose to global fame, not just as a transit point, but as a symbol of efficiency and ambition. In short, Singapore turned a weakness into a weapon. With no resources in the ground, it invested in the only resource it had, its people. Knowledge, trust, and location became the nation's new gold. Chapter 5: Fighting Corruption Like a Disease. In the 1960s, as new nations emerged across Asia and Africa, many were quickly crippled by a familiar enemy: corruption. Politicians lined their pockets, businessmen thrived on bribes, and favoritism replaced merit. Roads were half-built, funds vanished, and public trust evaporated. Singapore's leaders knew this disease would destroy them faster than poverty ever could. With no natural resources and few allies, the island's survival depended on trust. Trust from its citizens and trust from the outside world. Corruption, in any form, was poison. So the government drew a hard line. The Corrupt Practices Investigation Bureau, CPIB, originally set up by the British, was given unprecedented power. No one was beyond its reach. Cabinet ministers, senior civil servants, even friends of the ruling party. If they were caught taking bribes, they were prosecuted. There were no untouchables. Lee Kuan Yew set the tone himself. If you want to make money, don't join politics. Leadership, he insisted, was about service, not profit. To remove temptation, Singapore paid its civil servants and ministers competitive salaries, high enough to match the private sector. This was radical but effective. A well-paid official had little excuse to take bribes and every incentive to protect their reputation. At the same time, laws were strict and punishments swift. Even a small bribe could end a career. The results were dramatic. Investors began to see Singapore not as another unstable post-colonial state, but as a rare safe haven for business. Citizens, too, gained confidence that tax money was being spent on schools, hospitals, and housing, not luxury cars for politicians. In a region where corruption slowed growth, Singapore stood apart. Its honesty became a currency more valuable than oil, tin, or gold. It built a government that people could believe in, and that trust laid the foundation for prosperity. Chapter 6: Water. The weakness that became strength of all Singapore's early struggles, none was more basic or more dangerous than water. In 1965, the new nation had no rivers big enough to supply its people, no underground aquifers, and no natural lakes. Instead, Singapore imported the majority of its drinking water from Malaysia under long-term agreements. But those agreements came with a shadow. Politicians across the border occasionally threatened to turn off the tap as a reminder of Singapore's dependence. For a fragile young state, this was nothing short of terrifying. Without water, there is no city, no economy, no life. But instead of bowing to fear, Singapore turned its vulnerability into determination. The government made water security a national obsession. Every drop would be captured, recycled, or protected. Reservoirs were expanded, drainage canals built, and an island-wide system was designed to trap rainwater before it reached the sea. Rooftops became collection points, canals were rerouted, and urban planning revolved around conserving water. Then came the leap that astonished the world: new water. Engineers developed cutting-edge methods: microfiltration, reverse osmosis, and ultraviolet treatment to purify used water into crystal-clear drinking water. What had once been considered waste became a reliable source of life. By the 2000s, new water provided up to 40% of Singapore's needs, and desalination plants added another layer of protection. Suddenly, the nation that once feared a shut-off valve had become a global leader in water technology. This transformation was more than science. It was symbolism. Water, once Singapore's greatest weakness, had become proof of its resilience and creativity. Today, countries from the Middle East to Africa study Singapore's water model, hoping to copy its success. It is the perfect metaphor for the nation itself. Born with nothing, threatened with failure, yet able to turn scarcity into strength. Chapter 7: Discipline, not luxury. When outsiders looked at Singapore in the 1970s and 80s, they didn't see glitz or glamour. They saw rules, lots of them. The government banned chewing gum to prevent sticky messes on sidewalks and train doors. Littering carried heavy fines. Drug trafficking came with the death penalty. Graffiti was punished with caning. To many in the West, these measures looked extreme. Too harsh, too strict, even authoritarian. But for Singapore, discipline was not about appearances. It was about survival. Lee Kuan Yew defended it bluntly. If Singapore is a nanny state, then I am proud to have fostered such a society. In his eyes, order was the foundation for progress. Without it, the country risked sliding into chaos like so many other young nations. This discipline went beyond laws and into money. While other governments borrowed recklessly, Singapore saved. It built up enormous reserves and created sovereign wealth funds like GIC and Temasek Holdings. Instead of spending windfalls, it invested them for future generations. Those rainy day savings became lifelines during storms. In the Asian financial crisis of 1997, when currencies collapsed across the region, Singapore stayed steady. During the global financial crisis of 2008, while other nations drowned in debt, Singapore had the cushion to protect its economy and jobs. For everyday people, discipline shaped daily life. Streets were spotless. Public transport was efficient and reliable. Crime was rare. Singapore became known as one of the safest cities in the world, where children could walk home at night without fear. In the end, Singapore traded short-term freedoms and luxuries for long-term prosperity and security. And history proved it was the right choice. The rules that once seemed restrictive built the very stability that allowed the nation to thrive. Discipline, more than luck or resources, became Singapore's hidden strength. Chapter 8. The world takes notice. By the 1980s, the story of Singapore had shifted from one of doubt to one of astonishment. The tiny island, once dismissed as a doomed experiment, was now hailed as one of the Asian tigers, alongside South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong. Multinational corporations that once hesitated now rushed in. Electronics giants set up factories. Global banks opened offices. Shipping companies made Singapore a central hub, knowing its port was not only among the busiest in the world, but also one of the most efficient. Tourists, too, arrived in growing numbers, drawn by safety, cleanliness, and the sense that this was a country that worked. Then came two national icons that symbolized Singapore's rise. Changi Airport, launched in 1981, quickly became the envy of the world. It wasn't just an airport, it was a statement of ambition. With lush gardens, punctual flights, and seamless efficiency, it set a new global standard for travel. Meanwhile, the Port of Singapore cemented its place as a maritime powerhouse, connecting east and west with precision that competitors struggled to match. But Singapore didn't stop at factories or ports. It deliberately moved up the value chain. Low-cost assembly lines gave way to advanced electronics, finance, biotech, and high-tech services. The island that once exported rubber slippers now became a hub for microchips, pharmaceuticals, and international finance. Global leaders began to take notice. Delegations from developing nations visited to study what became known as the Singapore model, a blend of discipline, meritocracy, pragmatism, and forward planning. Even wealthy Western countries marveled at how a tiny, resource-poor island had leapfrogged decades of expected struggle. Against all odds, Singapore had not only survived, it had thrived. What was once a vulnerable backwater had become a global city, a symbol of what vision and discipline could achieve. The world had doubted Singapore's existence. Now it studied its success. Conclusion: why Singapore didn't fail. In 1965, Singapore was written off as a nation destined to fail. It had no natural resources, no reliable allies, no real army, and no sense of unity. On paper, it was a recipe for collapse. But history is not written on paper. It is written in action. Singapore refused to surrender to its weaknesses. Instead, it tackled them head-on. It fought corruption with ruthless consistency, proving that integrity could be a national advantage. It built homes, not just shelters, but communities that gave people pride and ownership. It educated its children with discipline and skills, turning human talent into its greatest resource. It built an army overnight, ensuring that no one could threaten its sovereignty. Even its deepest vulnerabilities became strengths. Water scarcity was transformed into a triumph of engineering and innovation. Financial caution turned into massive reserves that protected future generations. Tough laws and discipline created stability where chaos once seemed inevitable. But perhaps the most important achievement was unity. In a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, Singapore's leaders forged a shared vision: survival first, prosperity next. That vision bound its people together and gave them purpose. Today, Singapore's glittering skyline, efficient systems, and world-class institutions stand as proof. Where others saw only despair, Singapore built hope. It should have failed in 1965. Instead, it became one of the greatest survival stories in modern history. An island with nothing that turned itself into a nation with everything.